The moment my crutches hit the mud, I knew something in my family had finally broken for good. My brother Colm was standing 10 feet away from me in my parents' driveway, smiling like he had just won an argument instead of humiliated his own sister. One of my crutches had landed near the edge of the grass. The other had sunk halfway into a brown patch of mud left by the rain that morning. I was 31 years old, 3 weeks into recovering from a torn ligament in my knee and under strict instructions not to put my full weight on that leg yet. Callum knew that. Everyone standing behind him knew that. He still looked at me, shrugged, and said, "Then walk home." For a second, I honestly thought my father was going to step forward. He had that expression he always got when Colm crossed a line, the one where his mouth tightened and his shoulders stiffened. When we were kids, I used to think that expression meant Dad was about to defend me. I learned a long time ago that it usually meant he was deciding how little he could say without upsetting Colm. Then my brother laughed. Someone behind him laughed too. I heard my aunt make that uncomfortable little chuckle people make when they know something is wrong but do not want to be the first person to ruin the mood. And then my mother actually smiled and shook her head like we were two children fighting over a toy. "Nuff," she said. "Both of you are ruining the weekend. Both of us." That was the part that landed harder than the crutches hitting the ground. Colm had taken away the only things helping me stand properly, thrown them into the mud in front of everyone. And somehow my mother had already found a way to make us equally responsible. I looked at her. I did not yell. I did not cry. I just stared at her long enough that her smile disappeared. She looked away first. What happened in that driveway did not begin that afternoon. It had been building for most of my life. My name is Elowen Hartley, and if you had asked anyone in my family to describe me before that weekend, they probably would have used the same word: responsible. I heard it so often growing up that I thought it was part of my personality. I was the responsible daughter, the responsible sister, the one who remembered birthdays, picked people up from airports, handled insurance forms, found lost paperwork, made reservations, loaned money when someone was short, and stayed calm when everyone else was panicking. I work as a commercial insurance underwriter now, which is probably the least surprising career I could have chosen. My entire job is looking at risk, reading the details everyone else skips, and asking what happens when something goes wrong. Apparently I was very good at doing that for companies and terrible at doing it for my own family. Colm is 4 years younger than me. He is 27 now, and he has spent most of his life being described with softer words than the ones people used for me. Colm was finding himself. Colm was creative. Colm needed time. Colm had a good heart. When I was 22 and working full-time while finishing professional certifications at night, my parents praised me for being independent. When Colm was 22 and changed jobs 3 times in 1 year, my mother told me not to judge him because everyone develops at a different pace. That was how it worked in our family. Colm got patience. I got expectations. When he forgot my father's birthday, Mom said he had been busy. When I missed one Sunday dinner because I had the flu, she asked if something was wrong between me and the family. When Colm borrowed money, it was help. When I asked when he planned to pay me back, I was making things awkward. And every time I tried to point out the pattern, one of my parents would say some version of the same thing. "You're stronger than he is, Ellie." I used to hear love in that sentence. Now I hear the bargain hidden inside it. Because I was stronger, I was expected to absorb more. Because I was responsible, I was expected to forgive faster. Because Colm struggled, everyone else had permission to lower the bar for him. My father had his own version. "He's your little brother. Give him some room." The problem was that Colm kept getting older, and the room kept getting bigger. By the time he was 27, that room had somehow expanded enough to include my parents' lake house. The lake house had been in my mother's family since before I was born. It was not some luxury mansion. It was a 2-story cedar place with uneven floors, an old stone fireplace, a dock that needed repairing every few years, and a kitchen that looked like it had stopped changing sometime around 1998. But every important family memory seemed tied to that place. Christmas mornings, 4th of July weekends, my grandparents' anniversary, Callum learning to swim, me hiding in the upstairs bedroom after my first breakup because I did not want anyone to see me cry, Dad teaching us how to fish even though neither of us had the patience for it. Everyone loved that house. What almost nobody understood was what it cost to keep it. Callum especially loved talking about the lake house, as though it existed outside the normal rules of money. Taxes showed up, insurance premiums increased, the roof leaked, the dock shifted, trees had to be removed, pipes froze one winter. The place had sentimental value, but contractors did not accept sentimental value as payment. I knew that better than anyone because, for several years, I had quietly been helping my parents cover those costs. Callum did not know how much. In fact, he barely knew I was helping at all. That was partly his fault and partly my parents'. There had been a difficult period in our family a few years earlier, and certain things were never talked about afterward. My father especially preferred it that way. So Callum grew up into adulthood believing Mom and Dad had simply managed everything on their own. I never corrected him. At the time, I did not see any reason to. I was not helping for recognition. I was helping because the house mattered to my parents, and because I could afford to help, and because being the responsible one still felt like something I was proud of. Then Callum got engaged to Sienna Blake. Sienna was 28, smart, polished, and much quieter than my brother. I actually liked her. She had no idea how our family worked yet, and I remember thinking there was something almost peaceful about that. The engagement changed the way my parents talked about Callum. Suddenly everything was about giving him a good start. Mom started talking about grandchildren even though Callum and Sienna had not even set a wedding date. Dad started making comments about how hard it was for young couples to get ahead. And then came the family weekend at the lake house, the same weekend that ended with my crutches in the mud. We had barely finished lunch when my mother lifted her glass and smiled across the table at Callum and Sienna. She said she and Dad had been discussing something special. Callum already looked like he knew what was coming. That was my first warning. Mom reached across and squeezed Sienna's hand. "We thought it might make sense for you two to start using the lake house more permanently after the wedding," she said. I looked at my father. He avoided my eyes. Callum grinned. "We've already got some ideas for the place." That was my second warning. Because my mother had said use, Callum had heard ours, and I was about to discover that this was not a misunderstanding anyone planned to correct. The most unbelievable part was that Callum was already making plans for a house he did not own, while having absolutely no idea that for years, the person quietly helping keep that house in the family had been me. The thing about family favoritism is that it rarely announces itself as favoritism. It usually comes wrapped in reasonable words: need, timing, fairness, family. That afternoon, every one of those words got used to explain why Callum deserved more and why I was supposed to smile about it. After Mom made her little announcement about the lake house, Callum immediately started talking like he had just been handed keys at a closing. He leaned back in his chair, looked around the kitchen, and started listing everything he wanted to change. New flooring downstairs, a bigger refrigerator, better lighting over the island. He said the upstairs guest room could become an office for Sienna, and that eventually they might turn the smaller bedroom into a nursery. Sienna gave him a quick look when he said that, half amused and half embarrassed. "We haven't even picked a wedding date," she said. Callum laughed. "I'm thinking ahead." That was Callum. He had always been very good at thinking ahead when somebody else was paying for the future. I watched my parents while he talked. Mom was glowing. Dad had that satisfied expression he got whenever Callum sounded like he had a plan, even if the plan was mostly words. Nobody asked what I thought. That was not unusual. But this time it bothered me in a different way because I knew what sat underneath that house. I knew the tax bills. I knew what the last roof repair cost. I knew how much the insurance had jumped after a storm 2 summers earlier. I knew because some of those checks had come from me. So when Callum started talking about replacing the old dock and adding a covered outdoor kitchen, I finally asked, "Who's paying for all that?" The room changed instantly. It was almost impressive how fast a simple question could make everybody uncomfortable. Callum stared at me. Mom put her glass down. Dad cleared his throat. Sienna looked between us. "What do you mean?" Callum asked. "I mean exactly what I said. Renovations cost money. Maintenance costs money. Taxes cost money. If you're planning to treat the house like yours, are the bills going to be yours too?" He gave me this little smile I had known since childhood. It was the smile he used when he thought I was being ridiculous and wanted everyone else to know it. "Why are you doing this right now?" "Doing what?" "Turning something nice into a financial meeting." Mom jumped in before I could answer. "Elowen, nobody said they were taking the house away from anyone." That was technically true, and Mom loved technically true statements. They let her avoid whatever the real problem was. "You just said they're going to use it permanently." "More permanently," she corrected. "There's a difference." Callum leaned towards Sienna and said, "See, this is what she does. Everything becomes a contract." I ignored him and looked at Dad. "What exactly have you two decided?" Dad rubbed one hand over his jaw. "We're trying to help your brother get started. That's all." There it was again, help Callum get started. At 27, he had somehow been getting started for most of his adult life. I had been expected to be fully launched before I was old enough to rent a car without an extra fee. "Started with what?" I asked. "He and Sienna are building a life," Dad said. "Housing is expensive. They'll be married soon." "And I'm not building a life." That came out sharper than I intended. Mom sighed like I had disappointed her. "Don't make it about that." "About what?" "About comparing yourself to your brother." I actually laughed then, but there was nothing funny in it. "I'm not comparing us." "You are." Mom looked offended. "How?" "You just told me he needs this more because he's getting married." "That's not what I said." "It's exactly what you said." Dad stepped in with the tone he used when he wanted a conversation to end, without anybody having to admit anything. "Ellie, you've done very well for yourself. You have a good career. Your place is paid down. You're stable. Callum needs a start." For a second, I could not say anything. I had heard versions of that argument my entire life, but never quite so clearly. Everything I had done right had become evidence that I deserved less help. Everything Callum had failed to establish became evidence that he deserved more. My stability was not something they celebrated anymore. It was a resource they could redistribute. Callum leaned back, apparently satisfied Dad had settled it. "Exactly." I looked at him. "Exactly what?" "You don't need the lake house." "Neither do you." His smile disappeared. Sienna shifted beside him. Mom said my name quietly, warning me. But I was tired of hearing warnings every time I got close to saying something true. "I don't care if Callum and Sienna spend time here," I said. "That's not the issue. But if he's going to make decisions about the house, renovate it, act like it belongs to him, then he needs to take responsibility for what it costs." Callum scoffed. "You keep talking like you're the one paying for everything." I looked at Mom. Then Dad. Neither of them said a word. That silence told me more than any confession could have. Callum noticed it too, but he misunderstood what it meant. "What?" he said. "Did you pay for a new water heater once and decide you own the place?" Mom cut in. "This is getting unnecessary." "No," I said. "It's getting honest." Dad's expression hardened. "Watch your tone." That almost made me smile. Callum could casually plan renovations to a family property he did not own, but my tone was the emergency. I pushed my chair back slightly and took a breath. My knee was aching. I had been sitting too long, and the brace under my jeans felt tight. One crutch rested against the table beside me. The other was against the wall. "Here's what I'm saying," I told them. "If Colum gets the privilege, Callum gets the responsibility. I'm not continuing to pay toward a house that everyone else has decided he gets to control." Nobody moved. Callum stared at me like I had suddenly started speaking another language. Mom's face tightened. Dad looked down at the table. Sienna looked at Colum, then at me. "Continuing?" she asked quietly. Colum turned toward her. "She's exaggerating." I watched my father flinch at that word, just slightly. Colum did not see it. "How much do you think you've paid?" he asked me. I could hear the challenge in his voice. He expected some tiny number he could laugh off. I almost told him. Instead, I said, "More than you know?" He pushed his chair back and stood. "God, you really can't stand one weekend not being about you, can you?" Mom immediately said, "Callum," but softly, almost affectionately. I got up more carefully, reaching for my crutches. "This isn't about me wanting something," I said. "It's about me finally saying I'm not paying for you to have it." That was the first real no I had given my brother in years, and judging by the look on his face, he heard it as an act of war. Callum had never handled the word no very well, but that afternoon was the first time I realized how much of his confidence depended on believing my no did not matter. I left the kitchen because I could feel the conversation turning into the same argument we had been having since childhood. Callum would push. I would react. Mom would tell us both to stop. Dad would remind me I was older. Then somehow I would end up apologizing because I was the person most capable of doing it. I was not doing that again. I made my way out onto the back deck with my crutches and sat for a while, hoping everyone would cool down. My knee was throbbing, and I was already regretting coming that weekend. The injury itself was nothing dramatic. A bad landing during a recreational tennis game had torn a ligament badly enough that my doctor wanted me off the leg while it healed. I hated the crutches, but they were temporary. Another few weeks, maybe a little longer, and I would be walking normally again. What bothered me was how quickly my family had started treating my temporary limitation like a personality change. Mom complained that I was moving slowly. Callum joked about me needing special treatment. Even Dad had asked why I could not just leave the crutches in the car and use the railing around the house. It was as if needing help made everyone uncomfortable, because I had always been the one providing it. I stayed outside until I heard the sliding door open behind me. Callum stepped onto the deck alone. "You happy now?" he asked. I looked at him. About what? "Sienna thinks my family is insane. Maybe don't blame me for that." His jaw tightened. "You embarrassed me in there." I almost admired the sentence. 20 minutes earlier, Callum had been casually planning renovations to a property he did not own. I had asked who would pay for them. Somehow he was the one who had been humiliated. "I ask you a question." "No, you did your whole superior accountant routine." "I'm not an accountant." "You know what I mean." He folded his arms. "You always do this. You act like because you have the career and the condo and everything figured out, everybody else is irresponsible." "Never said that." "You don't have to." I pushed myself upright carefully. "Callum, if you want to live here, live here. If Mom and Dad want that, fine. But I'm not paying toward the place while you treat it like your private property." He stared at me. "Why do you keep saying you pay for it?" "Because I do." "What? A few repairs?" asked Dad. That stopped him for half a second. Then he laughed. "You really want me to believe Mom and Dad need you to keep this place? I want you to believe you don't know nearly as much about this family's finances as you think you do." I should have stopped there. Instead, our years of swallowed resentment pushed one more sentence out. "You've spent your whole life enjoying things without asking who cleaned up the bill afterward." His face changed. Not dramatically. Callum was not somebody who exploded every time he got angry. He got mean first. "At least I'm actually starting a family," he said. I felt that one. He knew I would. I had been single for almost 2 years after ending a long relationship, and Mom had made enough comments about my age that Colm knew exactly where to aim. "There it is," I said. "What?" "The reason you think you deserve more. Because you're getting married?" "No, I think Mom and Dad want someone here who actually enjoys being around them." I stared at him. Then I picked up my crutches. "We're done." I moved past him and headed around the side of the house toward the driveway. I had decided I was leaving early. I had driven myself there, and I wanted to be home before dark. Colm followed me. "That's it. You're going to make everybody miserable and then leave." "I didn't make anybody miserable." "You threatened Mom and Dad over money." I stopped beside my car. "I told them I'm not going to keep paying expenses for a house they want you to control." "That's not a threat." By then other people had started coming outside. Mom came first, followed by Dad and Sienna. My aunt and uncle were farther back near the porch. I hated that immediately. Private arguments in my family had a strange habit of becoming public whenever Colm needed an audience. "Can we please stop?" Mom asked. "I'm leaving," I said. "Problem solved." Callum laughed. "Of course you are." I reached toward the passenger door to put my bag inside. One of my crutches was tucked under my arm. Callum stepped closer. "You know what your problem is, Ellie?" "Callum." "Don't." Sienna's voice was quiet, but I heard it. He ignored her. "You think because you write a few checks, everyone has to ask your permission." I turned back toward him. "And you think because Mom and Dad never make you responsible for anything, responsibility doesn't exist." Dad said. "Elowen." There it was. My name, my warning. Not Colm's. Mine? I looked directly at him. "What, Dad?" He did not answer. Colm reached for the crutch under my arm. At first I thought he was making some stupid gesture, maybe trying to move it out of the way. Then he took it. "Give that back. You're so independent. Right? Callum." This time Dad said his name, but Colm was already reaching for the second crutch. I tried to pull it away, but balancing on one leg made that almost impossible. Sienna stepped forward. "Seriously, stop." Colm took the second one anyway. Then he walked several steps toward the muddy edge of the driveway and tossed them down. One landed flat. The other struck the wet ground and rolled into the mud. The whole thing took maybe 5 seconds. I remember every one of them. Callum looked back at me and spread his hands. "Then walk home." He laughed. My uncle let out a startled chuckle. Someone near the porch laughed too, probably because they thought this was still one of Colm's stupid jokes. Then Colm laughed harder. I looked at Dad. He looked angry, but he stayed where he was. I looked at Mom. She gave a short, uncomfortable laugh and shook her head. "Okay, enough. Both of you are ruining the weekend." Something inside me went completely still. "Both of us?" I asked. Mom's face changed. "You know what I mean?" "No. I don't think I do. Callum shouldn't have done that. But this whole argument has gotten ridiculous." I looked down at my crutches in the mud, then back at her. "And that's what you have to say?" "Elowen, please don't turn this into something bigger. There are moments when a relationship changes without anyone announcing it." That was one of them. My aunt finally walked into the mud herself, picked up both crutches, wiped them as best she could with an old towel from Dad's garage, and brought them to me. She asked if I wanted her to drive me home. I said yes. I did not trust myself behind the wheel anymore. Sienna would not look at Colm. Dad tried to say something as I got into my aunt's car, but I closed the door before he finished. Mom did not come after me. 20 minutes into the drive, my phone buzzed. A text from her. I expected an apology. Instead it said, "When you've calmed down, we can talk." I read it twice. Then I put my phone in my lap and stared through the window. For the first time, I was not angry at Colm. I was clear about him. There was a difference. Colm had been showing me who he was for years. The people I had refused to see clearly were my parents. I picked my phone back up and opened my contacts. I scrolled past Mom, past Dad, past Colm. Then I found a name I had not needed in several years. Martin Voss. He was the attorney who had prepared the paperwork the last time my parents nearly lost the lake house. And there was something about that paperwork my brother had never known. The next morning, I walked into Martin Voss's office, expecting him to tell me I was remembering the agreement wrong. Part of me almost wanted him to. It would have been easier to believe I had exaggerated my importance to the lake house than to admit my parents had spent years letting Colum enjoy a version of our family history that simply was not true. Martin had handled some estate and property work for my parents years earlier. He was in his mid-50s now, with the same careful way of speaking I remembered. He noticed the crutches immediately, but did not ask for the whole story until we were sitting down. "Tell me what changed," he said. So I did. I told him about Colum and Sienna, the announcement, the renovations, the argument. I even told him about the driveway, although saying it aloud made the whole thing sound more ridiculous than it had felt while I was standing there. Martin did not comment on Colum. He just opened an old digital file and started reviewing documents. Watching him brought me back 4 years, to a period my family almost never discussed. Dad had made several bad financial decisions around the same time his small contracting business lost 2 major clients. Nothing criminal or dramatic happened. He simply had too much going out and not enough coming in. My parents were stretched far thinner than Colum realized. The lake house became the obvious thing to sell. Mom was devastated. She had inherited her share of it through her family, and the idea of losing the place felt like losing the last physical connection to her parents. I had been 27 then, earning good money and living below my means. When Dad finally admitted what was happening, I offered to help. I still remember sitting at my parents' dining table while he stared at his coffee instead of looking at me. "Callum doesn't need to know about this," he said. At the time, I thought he was protecting my brother from worry. Years later, I understood there had been something else underneath it. Dad was embarrassed. He could tolerate needing help from his daughter if his son never knew he had needed it. I put up a substantial amount of money, enough to stabilize the immediate problem and keep the house from being sold during the worst possible moment. But Martin had insisted we document it. Families remember financial conversations differently once enough time passes. He told us back then. Dad had hated hearing that. I had insisted anyway. Now Martin pulled up the agreement and turned his monitor slightly toward me. The document did not secretly make me the owner of the lake house. It did not give me the right to throw my parents out, control their property, or magically take Colum's inheritance. What it did was much simpler. The money I had contributed was formally documented and under the agreement. My protected financial interest had to be addressed if the property was sold or transferred under the specified conditions. I had not handed my parents a giant undocumented gift. I had helped them with safeguards in place. "So if they let Colum use it, I can stop them?" I asked. Martin shook his head. "Not based on what I'm looking at. They still control their property. Your agreement protects your financial contribution. It doesn't let you dictate who spends weekends there." Strangely, that made me feel better. I did not want a legal weapon. I wanted clarity. What if they transfer ownership? Then we look at the exact structure before anything happens. Your parents cannot simply pretend this agreement doesn't exist. He paused. "But I think you're mixing 2 different issues." "What do you mean?" "The protected contribution is one issue. Everything you've voluntarily paid since then is another." That was when we started going through the numbers. I opened my banking records and a spreadsheet I had kept mostly for tax and budgeting purposes. Insurance-related increases 1 year. Part of a major plumbing repair. Tree removal after a storm. A contribution toward dock repairs. Smaller maintenance costs Mom would text me about because Dad was stressed. None of those later payments secretly bought me more ownership. Most were simply help. That distinction mattered. It also made what I saw next worse. No single payment looked outrageous. That was how I had justified them. $800 here, $1,500 there, A larger repair one summer, another expense the next spring. Together, they told a completely different story. I had become a quiet subsidy for a property my family was now discussing as Colum's future. Martin leaned back. Are you obligated to keep making these additional payments? I already knew the answer. No. Then why are you? I opened my mouth and stopped. Because Mom asked. Because Dad had struggled. Because the house mattered. Because I could afford it. Because saying yes had always been easier than making my parents uncomfortable. None of those answers sounded as good out loud as they had in my head. I thought I was helping my family. Maybe you were. Martin's voice stayed neutral. That doesn't mean you have to help forever. I stared at the spreadsheet. The strangest thing was that I did not feel triumphant. I felt embarrassed. I analyzed financial exposure for a living. I could look at a company and identify dependency risk in an afternoon. Yet I had somehow missed the most obvious dependency in my own family because it had been disguised as love and responsibility. My phone buzzed on Martin's desk. Dad. I let it ring. A minute later Mom called. I let that ring too. Martin waited until the screen went dark. What do you want to do? He asked. That was the question I had been asking myself since the driveway. Part of me wanted Colum to discover everything immediately. I wanted to sit him down with every receipt and watch his expression change. I wanted Mom to admit she had been wrong and Dad to tell Colum exactly who had kept the lake house from being sold years ago. But that would have been the old version of me again. Still explaining, still proving, still trying to force people to understand something they had benefited from not understanding. I closed the spreadsheet. Nothing, I said. Martin raised an eyebrow. Nothing? I don't want to do anything to them. I looked down at my crutches beside the chair. There were still faint brown stains near the bottom that I had not managed to scrub off. I want to stop doing everything for them. Martin nodded slowly. That afternoon, I went home and made a list. Not of ways to punish Colum. Not of things I could take from my parents. I made a list of every responsibility I had voluntarily picked up because someone in my family had decided I was the easiest person to ask. By the time I reached the bottom of the page, I understood something that should have been obvious years earlier. My family had spent a long time telling me how little I needed from them. They were about to find out how much they had needed from me. The first thing I stopped paying was so small that I almost laughed when my mother called about it. For years, that had been the trick. Nothing I did for my family looked important enough by itself to argue over. A repair here, a bill there, a phone call to straighten something out, a few $100s because Dad was short that month. An afternoon lost because Colum needed help with paperwork he had ignored for 3 weeks. Each favor was easy to explain. It was only when I put them all together that I realized I had become part daughter, part emergency fund, and part unpaid family manager. I spent the weekend after meeting Martin going through everything. I did not touch anything I was legally obligated to pay. I did not cancel anything that belonged to my parents or interfere with their accounts. I simply identified the expenses I had voluntarily taken responsibility for and started handing them back to the people who actually owned them. I removed my card from one recurring lake house service. I told a maintenance company that future invoices needed to go directly to my father. I emailed Dad copies of the records I had so there could be no confusion. I also told Martin I wanted all future discussions involving my protected financial interest in the lake house documented properly. No threats, no dramatic announcement, no family group text explaining how betrayed I felt. I was done explaining. The hardest part was how ordinary it felt. I had imagined setting a boundary would feel powerful. Mostly, it felt uncomfortable. Every time I stopped myself from fixing something, a voice in my head told me I was being selfish. That voice sounded a lot like my mother. 3 days later, Mom called. She still had not apologized. There's an invoice from the lake service, she said after about 30 seconds of small talk. I closed my eyes. There it was. Okay. They said they need a new payment method. Then Dad should give them one. Silence. I thought you handled that. I used to. Her voice tightened. So this is because of Saturday. I looked across my apartment at the Crutches leaning against the couch. Did you call about what happened Saturday, or did you call about the bill? Another silence, longer this time. Elowen, of course I care about what happened. You haven't said that? I texted you. You told me to calm down? Because you left without talking to anyone. I almost responded automatically. I almost started explaining why I had left, as though the muddy stains still visible on my crutches were not explanation enough. Instead I said, Callum took my crutches away from me, threw them into the mud, and told me to walk home. You laughed. I did not laugh at you. You laughed. I was uncomfortable. So was I, Mom. She exhaled sharply. What Callum did was immature. I've already told him that. Immature. At 27. Somehow my brother could still be reduced to a child whenever adulthood became inconvenient. Did he apologize? You know how he is. 4 words. That was our entire family system in miniature. You know how he is. Callum did not have to change because everyone else had already been trained to adjust around him. Yes, I said. I do know how he is. Mom apparently heard something in my voice because hers softened. Then don't let one stupid incident tear this family apart. I'm not tearing anything apart. I'm just not paying that invoice. She ended the call irritated. 2 hours later, Dad called. He did not bother with small talk. Your mother says you're cutting us off. I'm not cutting you off. You're cancelling things. I stopped paying one of your bills. You've always handled it. That doesn't make it mine. Dad was quiet for a moment. This is about Callum. It's about me. What does that mean? It means I'm done pretending being responsible makes me responsible for everyone. He made a frustrated sound. You're blowing up the family over one stupid joke. There it was again. A stupid joke. Not humiliation. Not disrespect. Not the moment I had looked at my parents for help and watched them stay still. A joke. Dad, if it was just a joke, why hasn't Callum called me? He had no answer. You know your brother is stubborn. You know I'm not. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. Dad started talking about keeping perspective. I stopped listening somewhere in the middle. For the first time in my life, I ended a call with my father before the problem was resolved. I have to go, I said. Ellie, send the invoice to whoever is responsible for the house. I hung up. My hands were shaking afterward, not because Dad had frightened me, because doing something that simple felt almost forbidden. That evening, my friend Naomi came over with takeout. She had known my family since college and had watched me leave dinners early to help Mom, loan Callum money, and spend entire Saturdays dealing with problems at the lake house. I told her everything. When I finished, she stared at me for a few seconds. Can I say something you're probably not going to like? You usually do. They don't miss your help because they miss you. I frowned. That's harsh. I'm not saying they don't love you. I'm saying right now they're angry because they miss not having to handle things themselves. I wanted to argue. Then I thought about Mom's first real call after the driveway. She had called about a bill. Naomi pointed at my phone. Has Callum apologized? No. Has he asked about your knee? No. Has he asked why you were upset? I shook my head. Then what exactly are you feeling guilty about? That question stayed with me. The next few days brought more calls. Mom wanted to know whether I was still planning to contribute toward a scheduled maintenance expense. Dad wanted access to records I had organized for him. I sent him the records. I did not send money. Every time I said no, they reacted like I had changed the rules. The truth was that there had never been rules. There had only been habits, and nearly all of them benefited someone other than me. Then, 5 days after the driveway, Callum finally contacted me. Not a call, a text. I opened it expecting, maybe stupidly, to see an apology. Instead it said, Mom says you're pulling some financial tantrum now. Keep your money, Ellie. We don't need it. I read the message once and put my phone down. A few minutes later, I picked it up again and started typing. I had 3 different responses in my head, each more satisfying than the last. I deleted all of them. Callum wanted an argument because arguments were familiar. In arguments, he could provoke me until I sounded angry and then point to my anger as proof that I was the problem. Silence gave him nothing, so I did not answer. The timing of his message was almost perfect. Sitting unopened in my email was the latest estimate for work the lake house would need before winter. It was not catastrophic, it was not enough to ruin anyone, but it was large enough that someone was going to have to make an actual decision instead of forwarding the problem to me. For years, that someone had been Elowen Hartley, not anymore. Callum had told me they did not need my money. He was about to get the chance to prove it. For about 2 weeks, Callum seemed convinced he had won. From what I heard, he told people I had finally backed off after making a scene at the lake house. That version suited him perfectly in Callum's story. He was the younger brother trying to build a future with his fiancée, and I was the successful older sister who could not stand watching him get something nice. He never mentioned the crutches. He definitely never mentioned the mud. Most importantly, he never mentioned the money, because he still did not understand it. I learned some of this from Mom, who kept calling under increasingly creative excuses. She would ask about my knee, spend 30 seconds pretending that was the purpose of the conversation, then casually mention some new lake house problem. The estimate I had seen was for work that needed to be done before colder weather. In previous years, Dad might have complained about the cost, Mom would have worried, and eventually someone would have asked if I could help. Usually I did. This time, I stayed out of it. Dad called 2 contractors for alternative estimates. Mom started going through household expenses. Eventually they did the thing I had been waiting for without admitting I was waiting for it. They asked Callum to contribute. According to Mom, he did not take that well. He has wedding expenses, she told me on the phone. I'm just saying the timing isn't ideal. I nearly laughed. Somehow there was never an ideal time for Callum to pay for anything. Then maybe the renovations can wait. That's what your father said. Her voice dropped slightly. Callum got upset. Oh, I'm shocked. Elowen. Mom. He wants to use the house like it belongs to him. Paying toward it is part of that. She was quiet. He says you're doing this to make a point. I'm not doing anything. That sentence irritated her more than anything else I could have said, probably because it was true. I had not created the repair. I had not raised the insurance costs. I had not invented property expenses. I had simply stopped standing between my family and bills that already existed. A few days later, Dad called and asked me where I kept records for one of the service companies. I emailed him the information. He thanked me, then stayed silent on the line. Something else? I asked. Your brother says he thought we were giving him the place. I leaned back in my chair. Are you? No. Did you tell him you were? Your mother said they could use it more after the wedding. Callum heard what he wanted to hear. Dad sighed. Apparently, that was the first crack, small but real. Callum had spent years benefiting from vague promises because my parents rarely corrected him when his interpretation favored him. This time, reality came with invoices. Meanwhile, Callum was still talking to Sienna about the lake house as if nothing had changed. I did not know that until later. But he was showing her renovation ideas, furniture, even pictures of a new dock. He told her they could spend most weekends there after the wedding, and suggested they might eventually make it their primary home. Sienna apparently asked the obvious question. What happened if my parents wanted to sell? Callum told her they would never sell because the house was, basically, staying with us anyway. That was not something my parents had promised. Not even close. The first person to realize there was a problem was Sienna. She was at my parents' house one evening when Dad and Mom started arguing in the kitchen. They thought she was outside with Colm. She had come back in for her phone. Dad was frustrated because Colm had refused to cover part of the upcoming work. Mom said they should give him time. Dad said time did not pay contractors. Then Mom said something Sienna had never heard before. Elowen used to handle this. Sienna stopped in the hallway. Dad apparently answered, "Well, Elowen isn't handling it anymore." Then came the sentence that changed everything for her. Mom said, "We should never have let Colm think this house was free." Sienna did not confront them immediately. She went back outside and asked Colm a few questions. Who actually owned the house? His parents. Had they signed anything giving it to him? No. Was he paying toward it? Not yet. Had he ever paid toward it? Not really. Then she asked about me. "Why does your mom keep saying Elowen used to handle the expenses?" Colm dismissed it. He told her I occasionally helped because I liked controlling family decisions. That was the story he needed to believe. But Sienna was not stupid. The more she asked, the less specific he became. At the same time, something unexpected was happening to me. My life was getting quieter. At first I kept checking my phone, because I was sure another emergency would arrive. Then I realized half of those emergencies had never been mine. I went to physical therapy. I worked. I had dinner with Nomi without leaving halfway through, because Mom needed me to compare contractor quotes. I spent an entire Saturday reading and doing absolutely nothing useful for anyone else. It felt strange. I keep waiting to feel guilty. I told Naomi one evening. "Do you?" "Sometimes." I thought about it. "Mostly, I feel quiet." Naomi smiled. "Maybe quiet is what happens when everybody else finally has to carry their own bags." My knee was improving too. I could put more weight on it, though I still needed the crutches outside. Every time I looked at the faint stain near the bottom of one, I remembered the driveway. But the memory was changing. At first, I remembered the humiliation. Now I remembered what happened afterward. I left. I did not apologize. I did not fix the mood. I did not send money to prove I still loved everyone. For once, my family had to sit in the discomfort they created. Then, one Thursday evening, my phone rang while I was making dinner. I glanced at the screen and almost ignored it because I did not recognize the number. Something made me answer. "Hello?" There was a short pause. "Elowen, it's Sienna." I put down the knife I was holding. We had never spoken privately on the phone before. "Hey, is everything okay?" Another pause. Her voice sounded careful, not angry. "I need to ask you something, and I'd rather hear the answer from you." I knew immediately this was about Colm. "Okay." Did Colm lie to me about the lake house? I did not answer right away. There were a dozen things I could have said. I could have told her exactly what I thought of my brother. I could have described every excuse my parents had ever made for him. I could have used the opportunity to hurt Colm the way he had hurt me, but that would have made this revenge. And I was beginning to understand that I did not need revenge nearly as much as I needed the truth to stop being hidden. So I pulled out a chair, sat down, and said, "Tell me what he told you." By the time Sienna finished, I realized Colm had not merely misunderstood my parents. He had built his future with her around promises nobody had ever actually made. The first thing I told Sienna was that I was not going to tell her what to think about my brother. If she wanted to know whether Colm was a good partner, that was something she had to decide for herself. But if she wanted facts about the lake house, I could give her those. "It told me your parents were basically giving it to us after the wedding," she said. "They're not." He said it would eventually be his anyway. "I've never heard Dad or Mom promise him that." She went quiet. Then she asked the question I knew was coming. "And what does your money have to do with it?" I explained the history without embellishing it. 4 years earlier, my parents had been in serious financial trouble. Selling the lake house had become a real possibility. I had provided enough money to help stabilize the situation, and Martin had documented my contribution in a written agreement. I made sure Sienna understood what that did and did not mean. I did not own the house. I could not decide who stayed there. My parents still controlled their property, but my financial interest could not simply be erased if certain things happened with the property. Then I explained the less formal part. Over the years, I had also covered a collection of maintenance expenses because my parents needed help and I could afford it. So Colin was right about one thing, I said. I don't own the house. But he knew you were paying for it? I don't think he knew how much. I'm starting to think he barely knew at all. Sienna exhaled slowly. He told me you used money to control your parents. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I cared what Colin thought of me anymore, but because it showed how thoroughly he had rewritten the story. I've never threatened to take their house, I said. I'm not doing that now. Then why are they talking about selling? You'd have to ask them. I stopped voluntarily covering expenses. What they do after that is their decision. She was quiet again. Why did you stop? I looked at the crutches beside my kitchen table. Did Colin tell you what happened in the driveway? Silence. That was answer enough. He said you two had a fight. I almost laughed. We did. I did not give her a dramatic speech. I told her exactly what happened. He took my crutches. He threw them into the mud. He told me to walk home. People laughed. My parents did not defend me. When I finished, Sienna said, he told me you threw a fit and left. That's his version. Were you trying to break us up when you told me all this? No. I meant it. Don't take my word for who Colin is. Just check what he told you. We ended the call shortly after that. I expected Colin to contact me eventually. He made it less than 2 hours. My phone rang at 9:17 that night. I almost let it go to voicemail, but this time I answered. What did you say to Sienna? No hello. No apology. Just accusation. She asked me questions. And you decided to poison her against me. I told her the truth about the house. Your truth? Property records and written agreements aren't really a matter of perspective. He went silent for a second. Then his voice sharpened. You couldn't stand seeing me happy. There it was again. Jealousy. The explanation that allowed Colin to avoid looking at anything he had actually done. This has nothing to do with your engagement. You've been against this from the beginning. I was against paying for a house you were treating like your own. Nobody asked you to keep paying. Exactly. He did not have an answer to that. Then he changed direction. Mom says you're making Dad consider selling. Dad is 61 years old. I'm not making him do anything. You know what stopping the money would do? Yes. It would make everyone responsible for their own share. You're unbelievable. Callum, you told me you didn't need my money. He hung up. The family meeting happened 3 days later. I did not ask for it, Dad did. He said we needed to stop having pieces of the same conversation through different people. Normally I would have avoided another confrontation, but Martin had reminded me that if my parents were seriously discussing changes involving the lake house, clarity mattered. So I went. I brought no dramatic folder of evidence. Dad already had the agreement. Mom already knew what I had contributed. The only person who had been kept in the dark was Colin. Sienna came too, although she sat separately from him at the dining table. That told me enough about how their week had gone. Dad started badly. He talked about misunderstandings, hurt feelings, and how everybody had said things they regretted. I let him speak until Colin interrupted. Can someone just tell me why Elowen thinks she has a claim on the house? Dad looked at me. For once, I did not rescue him. You tell him, I said. Dad's face tightened. He stared at his hands for several seconds. Then he finally said the sentence he should have said years earlier. Your sister put up the money when I couldn't. Colin stopped moving. What? 4 years ago, when the business was struggling. We were going to have to sell the lake house. You told me things were tight. You didn't say you were going to sell it. I didn't want you worrying about it. I almost corrected him. Then Dad continued. And I didn't want you knowing I couldn't handle it. That surprised all of us, including Mom. Callum looked from Dad to me. "How much?" Dad told him. I watched my brother's face change. For once, he had no sarcastic response ready. Sienna stared down at the table. "There's an agreement?" Callum asked. "Yes," Dad said. "Why?" His voice rose. "Why would you sign something with her?" I almost smiled at the wording, "with her," as though I had been some outside investor taking advantage of our parents instead of their daughter, helping them avoid a sale. Dad finally showed some irritation. "Because it was her money? Callum, so she's been holding this over us for 4 years. "No," I said. "I haven't mentioned it to you once in 4 years. Until I got engaged. Until you started planning renovations to a house you didn't own and expected other people to keep paying for." Mom tried to intervene. "Can we please not start attacking each other again?" This time Dad stopped her. "No, Diane, he needs to hear it." I looked at my father. That might have been the first time in my adult life he had allowed Callum to sit inside an uncomfortable truth instead of smoothing it over. Dad explained the rest. The maintenance costs, the expenses I had covered, the things he and Mom were now taking back over. Callum kept looking more offended than embarrassed. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" he asked. Dad's answer came quietly. "Because I was ashamed," Callum frowned. Dad looked directly at him. "I didn't want my son knowing I couldn't handle it." That sentence landed strangely. I understood Dad better in that moment, but understanding did not erase what his pride had cost me. To protect his image in front of his son, he had made his daughter's contribution invisible. Callum had grown entitled partly because Dad had hidden the price other people paid for him to feel secure. Sienna finally spoke. "So when you told me the house would basically be ours, you knew none of this?" Callum turned toward her. "I knew my parents wanted us to use it." "That's not what you told me." "Sienna, come on." "You told me we could plan around it." Callum looked at me as if I had engineered the entire conversation. "Happy?" he asked. "No." And I meant it. There was nothing satisfying about watching years of avoidance finally come apart, but there was relief in no longer carrying the secret for everyone. Dad rubbed his forehead. "None of this changes the immediate problem." Mom looked at him. "What immediate problem?" He took a breath. "The house costs more to maintain than we can comfortably justify right now. Elowen isn't covering what she used to cover. Callum says he can't contribute because of the wedding. We have other priorities." Callum stared at him. "What are you saying?" Dad looked toward the window, in the direction of a lake house none of us could see from there. "I'm saying we may have to sell it." For the first time since this started, Callum looked genuinely frightened, not because he was losing something he owned, because he was finally realizing that the future he had promised himself had always depended on other people paying for it. The possibility of selling the lake house did something no argument with me had managed to do. It forced Callum to put a price on the future he had been promising himself. Until that night, the house had existed in his mind as a family gift waiting for the right moment to become his. Now Dad was talking about maintenance, insurance, repairs, and the simple fact that sentimental value did not make any of those expenses disappear. Callum reacted exactly the way he always did when reality interfered with something he wanted. He tried to find someone else to solve it. "Selling is ridiculous," he said. "We're talking about a few expenses." Dad looked exhausted. "Then help pay them." Callum glanced at Sienna before answering. "We're saving for a wedding. And your mother and I are saving for retirement. So postpone some of the work. Some of it can wait. Some can't." Callum turned toward me. I knew what was coming before he spoke. "And you're seriously just going to sit there?" I almost admired how quickly he had returned to the old family script. A problem existed. Therefore, Elowen's refusal to solve it was the problem. "Yes," I said. "I am. You can afford to help. That doesn't make me responsible for helping." "You already were helping." "And now I'm not." Mom said my name softly, But I kept looking at Colum. "You wanted the house?" I said. "This is the house. Not the weekends, not the view. Not the idea of telling people you have a lake place. This is the responsibility that comes with it." Callum pushed back from the table. He muttered something about everyone being dramatic and left. Sienna stayed seated for another few seconds before quietly picking up her purse and following him. I went home expecting that meeting to be the end of my involvement. It was not. Over the next month, my parents looked at every realistic option. They postponed what could be postponed. Dad reviewed their finances. They considered whether rental income could offset some costs. But neither of them wanted the work and uncertainty that came with managing the property that way. Callum continued insisting they should keep it. He just never paired that opinion with enough money to make keeping it easier. Then Mom came to my apartment alone. She had never visited without calling first, and when I opened the door, she looked older than she had a month earlier. I let her in. We sat at my kitchen table. My crutches were still leaning near the hallway, though I was using them less around the apartment. Mom noticed them. Her eyes stayed on them for a moment before she looked away. "Your father thinks we should sell," she said. "I know. Callum is devastated." I waited. He and Sienna had plans. Plans based on a house they don't own. Mom frowned. "You know what I mean?" "I do. That's part of the problem." She folded her hands. "Is there any way you could help just until we figure something else out?" There it was, the old pattern one last time. I felt the familiar urge to make her feel better. I could afford to help. That was what made saying no difficult. If I had been broke, there would have been no moral decision at all. But I was not broke. I simply no longer believed my ability created their entitlement. "What does something else mean?" I asked. "Maybe Callum's situation changes after the wedding. Maybe your father picks up some consulting work. We just need time." "So you want me to keep paying until Callum is ready to take responsibility?" I didn't say it like that. "But that's what you're asking." Mom's eyes filled slightly. "This house matters to all of us." "It mattered to me when I helped save it 4 years ago." "I know." "Did it matter to Callum enough to contribute then?" I didn't know. "Does it matter enough for him to contribute now?" She had no answer. I leaned back. "Mum, you're asking me to make Callum's life easier again. I'm asking you to help your family. I have helped my family." My voice stayed calm for years. She looked down. "So that's it? For the house?" "Yes, the sale did not happen overnight. Real life is rarely that clean. There were discussions, paperwork, inspections, and several moments when Mom changed her mind. Eventually, my parents listed it. The property attracted more interest than Dad expected, partly because the area had become more desirable over the years. When an acceptable offer came in, Mom cried before agreeing. I felt sad too. That surprised me. I had spent so much time defending my right not to save the house that I had forgotten I was also losing a place I loved. But sadness did not mean the decision was wrong. When the sale closed, Martin made sure my documented financial interest was handled according to the agreement. I received what I was legally entitled to. Nothing more. My parents received what belonged to them. There was no secret takeover, no dramatic courtroom scene, no moment where I took everything and left them with nothing. The truth was almost simpler than revenge. I stopped subsidizing a situation that no longer made sense for me, and my parents made their own financial decision afterward. Callum still blamed me. He had apparently convinced himself that if I had continued paying, the house would eventually have become his. Maybe he was right that it could have stayed in the family longer. But he never answered the obvious question. Why was preserving his future my responsibility? His relationship with Sienna started unraveling around the same time. I heard about it from Mom, who tried very hard not to sound like she was blaming me. Sienna had postponed some wedding planning. Callum told everyone it was because she was stressed. I suspected there was more to it. Sienna confirmed that when she sent me a short message a week after the closing. She did not give me private details about their relationship. She only wrote, "For what it's worth, the house was never the real problem." Later I learned what she had told Colm. The house isn't the problem. You lying about your life is? He had not invented a fake identity or hidden some dramatic secret. What bothered her was subtler. He had presented possibilities as promises, his parents' resources as his own, and my contributions as evidence that I was controlling. Once she discovered one version of reality had been shaped to make Colm look better, she started questioning the rest. A few days after the sale, Mom asked to meet me again. This time we went to a quiet coffee shop. She looked tired. For several minutes, we talked about ordinary things. My knee, work, Dad. Then she put down her cup. "I still don't understand how we got here." I knew what she meant. The house was gone. Colm was furious. Sienna was reconsidering their future. I barely visited. The family she had spent years trying to keep together felt less together than ever. "You think I did this?" I said. "I think you could have stopped it." "Stopped what?" "The house from being sold. Things getting this bad with your brother. All of it." There was no anger in her voice. That made it harder. "Mom, I didn't make Colm refuse responsibility. No. I didn't make Dad hide the financial problems from him. No. I didn't make you promise Colm more access to the house than anyone had discussed with me." "We weren't trying to hurt you?" "I know." She looked relieved for half a second. Then I continued. "That doesn't mean you didn't." Her eyes dropped to the table. Was all of this really because of what happened that weekend? I thought about the question. No. That weekend was just when I finally understood it. Understood what? That Colm could do almost anything, and you'd still come to me to make things easier. Mom shook her head. "That's not fair." "I took my crutches?" "Mom." She closed her eyes. "I know. I threw them in the mud and told me to walk home." "I know. And when I looked at you, you laughed." Her eyes opened. "Elowen, I was nervous. I didn't think it was funny. But you laughed." She started crying quietly. I did not enjoy it. I did not feel victorious. I just felt tired. "When I needed you to stand up for me, Mom, you laughed." She wiped her face with a napkin. I knew he was wrong. That was the first time she had said it that plainly. "Then why didn't you say it?" She stared at the table for a long time. "Because I knew you would forgive us." I felt something in my chest loosen, not because the answer was good, because it was finally honest. She had spent years confronting the child she believed was safest to confront, me. I was reasonable. I would calm down. I would forgive. I would come back. Colm was harder, so everyone adjusted around him. "That's the problem," I said. Mom nodded through tears. After a while, she asked the question I knew would eventually come. "Can we fix this?" I looked at my mother and realized I did not know yet. I knew I did not want revenge. I knew I did not want her suffering. But I also knew that fixing our relationship could not mean rebuilding it exactly as it had been. Because for the first time in my life, I had learned that forgiveness and access were not the same thing. The strange thing about finally setting boundaries was that nobody in my family knew what to do with me once I stopped arguing about them. For years, I had assumed standing up for myself would mean becoming harder, angrier, maybe even colder. Instead, a few months after the lake house was sold, my life felt lighter than it had in years. My knee healed first. Physical therapy was slow and boring, but eventually my doctor cleared me to walk without the crutches. The first morning I left my apartment without them. I stood in the hallway for a second longer than necessary. I had spent weeks wanting to get rid of those things, yet putting them away felt strangely emotional. There were still faint stains near the bottom from the driveway. I never cleaned them completely. Maybe some part of me did not want to. My leg healed faster than some other things did. Mom and I started talking again, carefully. Not every day. Not even every week at first. She stopped calling me with problems to solve, which I later learned was harder for her than simply apologizing. Our conversations became shorter but more honest. If Dad needed help finding something, he found it himself. If Mom had a question about a bill, she called the company instead of me. These were tiny changes, but in our family they felt enormous. Dad asked me to lunch one Saturday. He looked uncomfortable from the moment we sat down, and I knew he had rehearsed whatever he wanted to say. "I owe you an apology," he said. I waited. The old me would have rescued him from the silence. I would have said it was fine before he even explained. This time, I let him finish. "I was ashamed that I needed your help," he said. And instead of admitting that, I acted like your help wasn't important. I looked at him across the table. "You let Colin believe that too?" "I know," he nodded. "I made your strength an excuse to give your brother more." That sentence stayed with me, because it was the first time either of my parents had described the pattern without trying to soften it. Dad apologized for the driveway too. He admitted he should have stepped in the second Colin touched my crutches. I accepted the apology. What I did not do was tell him everything could go back to normal. Normal had been the problem. Colin took longer, for almost 2 months. We barely spoke. His engagement to Sienna remained uncertain. I deliberately stayed out of it. Whatever happened between them belonged to them. I had spent enough of my life managing Colin's consequences. Then one evening, he asked if we could meet. We chose a coffee shop halfway between our apartments. He arrived before me and looked different somehow. Not transformed, just less certain. "I'm sorry about the crutches," he said after we sat down. I was angry. I nodded. "Okay." He seemed surprised that I did not immediately make it easier for him. "I shouldn't have done it." "No, you shouldn't have." He looked down at his coffee. "But you have to understand, it felt like you were trying to take everything away right when things were finally going well for me." There it was. The but. I almost laughed. "Callum, an apology doesn't come with an invoice for access." He frowned. "What does that even mean?" "It means saying sorry doesn't buy you the old version of me back." His expression tightened, but he did not leave. That mattered. I told him I was willing to have a relationship with him if that relationship was based on respect. I would not loan him money. I would not intervene with Mom and Dad on his behalf. I would not fix problems because he had waited too long to handle them. And if he ever treated me the way he had in that driveway again, I would leave. "So you're just never going to help me again?" he asked. That question told me how far he still had to go. "I'm your sister," I said, "not your emergency fund." We did not hug when we left. There was no dramatic reconciliation, but he apologized again before walking away, and the second apology did not include an excuse. That was enough for that day. Naomi noticed the difference in me before I did. A few weeks later, we were walking through a park after lunch. Walking, no brace, no crutches, no careful calculation about how far I could go before my knee started hurting. She asked whether I had forgiven my family. "I think so," I said. "That sounds uncertain." "I'm not angry every morning anymore." "That's not what I asked." I smiled. "Then yes, mostly." "And everything goes back to normal?" "Absolutely not," she laughed. I did too. "I can forgive them without volunteering for the same job again." That was the part I wished I had understood years earlier. Forgiveness did not mean pretending something never happened. It did not mean restoring the exact access someone had before they hurt you. It did not mean paying their bills, carrying their responsibilities, or accepting the same behavior because they shared your last name. The money I received after the lake house sale went into my own long-term savings and investments. For once, I did not immediately look around for someone else who needed it more. Mom and Dad adjusted, Callum adjusted more slowly, and I adjusted to something I had never really experienced before, being loved without constantly proving my usefulness. The lake house was gone, and I still missed it sometimes. I missed the old fireplace and the dock, and the upstairs room where I had spent so many summers. But I learned that memories do not disappear when a property changes hands. I did not need to keep financing a building to prove those years mattered. Months after the sale, I drove past the road that led toward the old place. I did not turn down it. Instead, I parked near a walking trail a few miles away. The weather was cool, and the path was still damp from rain the night before. I walked for nearly an hour. At one point I stopped beside a muddy patch near the edge of the trail, and for the first time the memory of Callum throwing my crutches did not make my stomach tighten. He had told me to walk home, because he thought taking away my support made me powerless. What he never understood was that the hardest walking I had to do had nothing to do with my knee. It was walking away from the role my family had assigned me, the responsible one, the forgiving one, the one who could take more because she was stronger. I still loved my family. I just stopped believing love required me to make their lives easier at the expense of my own. Callum once told me to walk home because he thought I couldn't. In the end, walking away from the way they treated me was the first step I had taken entirely for myself. About 6 months after the lake house was sold, I realized something had changed when my phone rang on a Sunday morning, and I did not immediately tense up. It was Mom. She was calling to ask if I wanted to have lunch. That was it. No contractor waiting for an answer, no bill she wanted me to look at, no problem involving Callum that somehow required my opinion, my money, or my time. Just lunch. Dad had changed too. He never asked me to take over their finances again, and when he needed advice, he asked instead of assuming. Callum and I were still rebuilding something that I would not call closeness yet. He had started handling more of his own problems, partly because I gave him no alternative. His future with Sienna remained theirs to figure out, and I kept myself out of it. That might have been the biggest change of all. I finally understood that loving someone did not require managing the consequences of their choices. I used part of the money returned to me from the lake house to strengthen my own savings, and I kept the rest invested for my future. I did not feel guilty about that anymore. The old version of me would have immediately found another family emergency to absorb it. The person I was becoming finally understood that my future deserved protecting too. Sometimes I still thought about that driveway. I remembered the mud. I remembered Callum laughing. Most of all, I remembered looking toward my parents and waiting for someone to stand up for me. For a long time, I thought that was the worst memory of the entire experience. Now I see it differently. It was the moment I stopped waiting for my family to decide that I deserved respect and started deciding it for myself. Callum thought throwing away my support would make me helpless. Instead, it exposed how much support I had been giving everyone else. I never destroyed my family. I never took their home. I never ruined my brother's future. I simply stopped protecting people from the natural consequences of their own decisions. And once I did, the truth handled the rest. I still love my parents. I still love my brother. But I love them now without abandoning myself, and that has made all the difference. So if someone in your family hurt you, everyone else laughed or looked away, and then they expected you to keep showing up like nothing happened, what would you have done in my place? Would you have forgiven them, or would you have walked away too?